Welcome to the debate. In a recent and honestly rather terrifying psychological study, researchers put people in an empty room for just 15 minutes with absolutely nothing to do.
Yeah, it's a wild study. Just a completely bare room.
Exactly, stripped completely bare, except for one single thing: a button that would deliver a painful electric shock. And a staggering number of people actually chose to physically shock themselves rather than, just sit alone quietly with their own unguided thoughts.
Which is just crazy to think about.
Right. So today we are looking at the ultimate modern fantasy, which is the empty calendar. I mean, if you're commuting to work right now or listening to this while running errands, you might be thinking, I would kill for some idleness right now.
Oh, absolutely. We treat the vacation with zero itinerary or, that retirement that stretches out into an endless horizon of doing nothing as the ultimate reward for our labor.
But when we look across millennia of ancient philosophy, major world religions, and now modern neuroscience, we find a striking consensus. Chronic idleness is not a sanctuary. It's actually a structural threat to the human psyche and the physical body.
And it's a fascinating paradox, right? Because we all intuitively crave rest. Yet when we actually get it in an absolute unstructured form, we tend to just fall apart. So today we are debating what exactly makes this state of idleness so destructive.
Exactly. I will be arguing that human beings are fundamentally action-oriented organisms. We require the literal, physical, and cognitive friction of goal-directed effort to survive. And a lack of that effort acts as an inherent pathogen. It's basically a state of biological and psychological entropy.
Right. And I will be arguing that framing idleness merely as a lack of action or a lack of friction fundamentally misdiagnoses the pathology. The true threat of the empty calendar isn't the absence of mechanical effort.
Then what is it?
The danger is the deprivation of meaning, of social integration, and collective purpose. What we are really talking about is a crisis of lost social structure and identity, not, a mechanical failure to stay busy.
Let's start with this idea of entropy, because I think the physics metaphor translates perfectly to human biology. Entropy in thermodynamics is the natural drift of a system from order into chaos when no energy is applied to maintain it. And the human mind and body operate on that exact same principle. When you remove the resistance of a challenge, human systems literally rust out. I mean, we talk endlessly about burnout from overwork.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Right, but the clinical reality of rust out, the metabolic and psychological decline from understimulation, it's just as real.
But what does rust out actually look like in practice? Because if you tell someone who is working 60 hours a week that doing nothing will cause them to rust, they aren't going to believe you.
No, they don't believe it, and that's because of what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called the flow paradox: engagement. And he found that if you survey people on a Friday and ask them to predict what will make them happy this weekend, they will systematically say doing absolutely nothing.
Naturally.
But when you ping those same people throughout the weekend and actually measure their momentary happiness, it is drastically lower when they are lounging on the couch compared to when they're engaged in an effortful, structured, challenging activity.
Which is a brilliant observation of human behavior, obviously. But I think you are drawing the wrong conclusion from it. You're describing the symptom, but you're missing the underlying disease here.
How so?
Well, when you say we need friction or action to maintain our biological order, you are ignoring what that action actually represents in a human life. Let's look at social psychologist Marie Jahoda.
Okay.
She developed what's called the latent deprivation model. She studied what happens to people during periods of severe unemployment. And she found that the psychological damage doesn't come from a lack of physical or mental friction. It comes from losing 5 very specific latent functions that work provides.
And those are?
Those are time structure, social contact, collective purpose, status, and activity. Now notice that only one of those 5 is activity. The rest are entirely about our connection to the world and to other people.
I see the distinction you are making, but aren't those inextricably linked?
They are linked, sure, but the root cause of the suffering isn't the lack of motion. Let's make this concrete. Think about a guy who has been a factory foreman for 30 years, and he retires.
Okay.
On Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., he doesn't just lose his paycheck, and he doesn't just lose the physical act of walking the factory floor, he loses the reason he set his alarm clock. That's his time structure.
Right.
He loses the guys he gets coffee with, his social contact, and he loses his title as foreman, his status. So the damage to his psyche isn't because he lacks a hammer to swing, it's the lack of an identity.
But identity is built through action.
Well, let's look back to the Christian monastic tradition, because they dealt with this exact crisis of the empty calendar. Early monks went out into the desert to do literally nothing but pray.
Right. The Desert Fathers.
Exactly. And they began suffering from a profound danger they called acedia, which translates roughly to spiritual listlessness. They called it the noonday demon.
It was a kind of ancient depression, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. But Thomas Aquinas didn't define acedia as physical inactivity. He defined it as a failure of love and a sorrow over spiritual goods. It was an active rejection of one's calling.
Interesting.
The vacuum that forms when we are idle isn't caused by a lack of motion. It's a lack of connection to something larger than the self.
I mean, you're drawing a very firm line between mechanical effort and abstract meaning. But I don't think human biology respects that boundary. Let's look at the literal neurobiology of this vacuum you were talking about. What is physically happening in the brain when we are idle?
You're talking about the default mode network.
Yes, exactly, the DMN. So when the human brain is not engaged in some goal-directed activity,
Like when you aren't focused on a specific task?
right, the brain doesn't just power down into sleep mode, It defaults to this specific neural circuit, the default mode network. And during chronic idleness, the DMN just goes into absolute overdrive.
Overdrive in what sense?
It becomes an engine for rumination. The DMN is highly involved in self-referential thought. So without an external task to process, the brain begins scanning the past for regrets and scanning the future for anxieties. Think of the idle human mind like a muscle in zero gravity. Without the resistance of gravity, a muscle doesn't just rest peacefully, it actively atrophies. And the idle mind does something worse. It turns on itself.
Wow.
This is exactly why those people in that study were shocking themselves. We literally prefer acute physical pain to the internal biological entropy of an unoccupied mind. Our biology aggressively rejects the absence of a task.
Okay, the zero-gravity muscle analogy is powerful, I'll give you that. And the rumination data is very real, but I come at it from a different way. I have to challenge this idea that the default mode network is inherently pathological when it's left to its own devices.
Well, it is pathological if it's left untethered for too long.
But the DMN is also the literal seat of human creativity. It's responsible for empathy, for complex problem solving, and for deep moral reflection.
Sure, it has utility.
Right, when you have a shower thought that solves a problem you've been stuck on for weeks, that is your DMN at work. You don't solve the problem of rumination by just frantically shucking yourself with tasks to keep the brain occupied. The frantic pursuit of action just to escape our own thoughts is exactly the kind of neurosis that Eastern traditions warn us about.
How do they distinguish between productive reflection and toxic rumination then?
Buddhism has a highly sophisticated framework for this. They explicitly warn against sloth, which they call thenamida. It's a kind of heavy, dull lethargy.
Okay.
But in the Eightfold Path, the concept of right effort requires neutralizing those unwholesome mind states without overcompensating. They explicitly warn that energy that is too forceful leads to restlessness and anxiety. You cannot just treat the human being as a machine that needs its gears spinning constantly to avoid rusting.
But if the gears aren't spinning, the machine breaks down.
Aristotle made a critical distinction here that I think bridges our gap. The concept of scholae, which is where we get the word school, but it originally meant true leisure.
True leisure?
Right. Now, scholae physically looks like doing nothing. You are sitting, you are contemplating, you are reading. To an outside observer, it is physical inaction.
Because there's no friction.
But internally, it is active mental contemplation directed toward virtue. It prevents the DMN from becoming toxic not by giving the brain a frantic mechanical task to distract it, but by giving the mind an anchor.
I hear you, and the concept of scholae is beautiful in theory. But we cannot separate the mind and the body in a way the epidemiological data just doesn't allow.
The data.
Yeah, we can talk about Aristotle and contemplation all day, but let's look at the brutal, physical reality of what happens when we remove structured effort from a human life.
You're talking about the mortality data?
Yes, and the numbers are absolutely staggering. A landmark meta-analysis of over 20 million people showed that unemployment is associated with a 63% higher risk of all-cause mortality.
Wait, let's clarify that. Are we talking about deaths of despair, like psychological decline leading to substance abuse, or are we talking about literal biological failure?
Both. We are talking about cardiovascular disease, immune system failure, literal physical death. And if you think that 63% spike is just about the financial stress of losing a job, let's look at retirement, where the financial needs are theoretically met.
Okay.
The National Bureau of Economic Research and Social Security data looked at men who retire at exactly age 62. The moment they stop working, they face a 2% spike in mortality.
Just in that first year?
Yes. That translates to 11,000 additional deaths in the single year after their 62nd birthday, purely because they stopped working. Conversely, delaying retirement and working longer decreases mortality by 11% per year.
That is a lot.
It is. This isn't just about losing a sense of love or meaning like Aquinas talked about. When you stop working, when you remove the daily physical and cognitive friction of overcoming obstacles, the biological organism literally begins to die. The systems just shut down.
Look, the data is undeniable. 11,000 excess deaths is a tragedy. But your interpretation of the causal mechanism is where we diverge.
How so?
You are looking at that 63% mortality spike in the unemployed, and that 2% spike in 62-year-old retirees, and assuming the cause of death is the cessation of labor, the lack of cognitive or physical friction.
Because the friction is what keeps the heart pumping and the brain plastic?
Right, but I look at that exact same data, and I see the ultimate proof of Marie Jahoda's latent deprivation thesis. Think back to our factory foreman who retires at 62. Why does his immune system fail? Why does he have a heart attack at 63?
Because he stops moving.
No, it isn't because his muscles suddenly lack the friction of walking the floor. It is because society has suddenly stripped away his status.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. How does a loss of status translate to a heart attack?
Through profound biological pathways. When a human being is socially severed, when they lose their collective purpose and their daily social contact, the body registers that as an existential threat.
You mean stress hormones.
Exactly. Cortisol levels spike. Chronic inflammation takes over the body. The nervous system is locked in a state of hyperarousal because from an evolutionary standpoint, a human separated from the tribe is in mortal danger.
Well,
The organism doesn't die because it stopped moving or because it lacked a crossword puzzle to solve. It dies because it has been socially severed. It is in exile.
okay. The link between social isolation, cortisol, and inflammation is a very fair point. I will concede that the biological impact of loneliness is devastating. But here's where your latent deprivation theory hits a wall for me.
Go on.
You're talking about these 5 functions: time structure, social contact, collective purpose, status, and activity. You're talking about them as if they are abstract concepts floating in the ether. They aren't. They inherently require structured action to exist.
You're saying meaning requires action?
Absolutely. You cannot have time structure without an activity to anchor the time. You can't just stare at a clock and call it structure. You cannot have collective purpose without physically or mentally doing something for the collective.
I mean, sure.
Even status is derived entirely from what we do and how we contribute. You are trying to separate the meaning from the mechanics, but the mechanics generate the meaning.
See, I wouldn't say the mechanics generate the meaning. I'd say they are a vehicle for it.
But without the vehicle, you go nowhere. When those men retire and die at 62, it is because they have lost the behavioral momentum that forces them out into the world to interact with the tribe.
Behavioral momentum.
Yes, inactivity is a maintaining cause of physical decay and low mood. Think about clinical psychology. The gold standard treatment for severe depression is behavioral activation.
Right. Forcing the patient to engage with their environment.
Exactly. When someone is severely depressed, you don't just sit them on a couch and try to philosophize with them about their lack of collective purpose. You tell them to make their bed at 8 a.m.
Yeah.
You tell them to walk to the mailbox at 9 a.m. Why? Because the physical friction creates a dopamine cascade. We force an increase in structured activity. We make them move, and the meaning follows the motion.
If meaning simply followed motion, then the busiest people in our society would be the most fulfilled and the longest lived.
But we know that extremes are always dangerous.
But burnout is just as lethal as rust out. The frantic busy work of modern corporate life is literally killing people with stress, even though they have endless behavioral momentum. Let me introduce another piece of epidemiological data that cuts right to the heart of this. Let's look at the research on ikigai.
Oh, the Japanese concept of purpose?
Yes, it translates roughly to a reason for waking up in the morning. Epidemiological studies out of Japan show that older adults with high ikigai have a 20% lower mortality risk. In fact, having a strong sense of purpose is nearly 1.8 times as effective for longevity as not smoking.
Wait, 1.8 times as effective as not smoking? That's incredible.
It is. And here is the key. Having ikigai does not inherently require constant mechanical action, and it certainly doesn't require grueling behavioral momentum.
Okay.
A grandfather whose ikigai is passing down family history to his grandchildren is not engaged in high-friction labor, but his biological systems are protected. Why? Because purpose aligns the nervous system.
It reduces the threat response.
Exactly. It tells the body, you are still needed. It drastically lowers that cortisol and inflammation we talked about. You don't need to force an organism into constant frantic motion if the organism inherently knows why it is here.
Okay, the Ikigai data is fascinating, and I agree that purpose organizes the nervous system. But doesn't passing down stories to grandchildren still require the literal friction of cognitive effort?
I mean, slightly, yes.
You still have to wake up, organize your thoughts, read the room, and engage with another human being. You are still doing something.
It's an action, yes, but it's not the action that's saving his life. It's the connection.
I argue it's both, and the ancient philosophers understood this perfectly. They viewed the human being as a zone practicon, a creature of action.
Right.
For them, virtue wasn't just a state of mind. It was a muscle that atrophied without use. And because they recognized that human beings, when left to their own devices, naturally drift toward the path of least resistance, they didn't just tell people to find their purpose and hope for the best.
They built systems.
Exactly. They prescribed structural mechanisms to force activity. Let's go back to your Christian monks in the desert. The Benedictine monastic order eventually realized that just sitting and praying was driving the monks insane.
So they instituted the rule of ora et labora, pray and work.
Right. Manual labor became part of the spiritual practice. It wasn't just a hobby, it was life support. They knew that if the monks just sat in their cells, the noonday demon of acedia would destroy them. So they instituted mandatory manual labor.
To keep them busy.
They forced them to grow crops, brew beer, and meticulously copy manuscripts. They used the literal physical friction of work as a structural fix to guard against psychological and spiritual entropy. They knew that motion was the non-negotiable prerequisite for spiritual health.
Look, I agree that ora et labora was a brilliant structural fix, but look closely at exactly how those traditions implemented that structure. They didn't demand relentless, unbounded activity.
True.
They didn't worship busyness. They demanded a rhythm. They were equally rigorous about enforcing rest. If you want to talk about structural mechanisms, we have to talk about bounded rest.
What do you mean by bounded rest?
Well, look at the Jewish Sabbath. It strictly prescribes rest, but it does so as a deliberate, time-limited contrast to labor, not a permanent replacement for it. The boundary is what makes it restorative.
Ah, I see.
The danger these traditions were guarding against wasn't the absence of work, it was untethered time.
So the vacuum isn't just not working, it's not knowing what the time is for?
Precisely. The Stoic philosopher Seneca defended otium, leisure time, as an absolutely vital period for cultivating inner virtue. But his version of leisure wasn't mindlessly scrolling on a couch.
Right.
The key to otium is that the leisure is intentional. It is directed towards self-improvement, relationship building, or philosophical contemplation. The problem with our modern fantasy of the empty calendar isn't that it lacks work, it's that it lacks intention.
That makes a lot of sense.
When rest is bounded and directed toward the good, it restores the body. When time is untethered and aimless, it destroys us. The vacuum is created by aimlessness, not by stillness.
I think that distinction between aimlessness and stillness is profound, and it brings us to a real synthesis of the ancient philosophy, religion, and modern neuroscience we've been discussing.
Definitely.
However, my core position remains that human beings require the friction of meaningful effort to survive. Chronic idleness, the fantasy of the totally empty calendar, is a state of psychological entropy. We see it in the brain. Without a task, the default mode network turns on itself, generating rumination and anxiety. We see it in the body. Without the resistance of daily challenges, our physiological systems degrade, leading to that massive 63% increase in mortality for the unemployed.
The data is stark.
It is. Whether we call it the flow paradox or rust out, the evidence points to one inescapable biological reality: motion, effort, friction, action. It is the non-negotiable price of a flourishing life. We simply cannot think our way into well-being while our bodies remain idle.
And while I absolutely agree that stagnation is a mortal threat, framing it merely as a deficit of action or friction ignores a much deeper human reality. The true antidote to idleness isn't just movement.
Right.
It certainly isn't busyness for its own sake, which only leads to burnout. The solution is cultivating a life where both our rest and our activity are integrated into a social fabric. The men who die tragically soon after retirement aren't dying because they stopped typing on keyboards.
Yeah.
They are dying from a deprivation of meaning, a loss of status, and a severing of collective purpose. The ancient concept of acedia wasn't laziness, it was a failure to love the world around you. We don't just need tasks to occupy our neural networks, we need a reason to exist for others.
Well, it seems clear that if there is a point of convergence between our perspectives and indeed between Aristotle, the Desert Fathers, and modern epidemiologists, it is this: stillness is sacred, but stagnation is lethal.
Exactly right. The human animal is simply not designed to survive in a vacuum. Looking at the structural challenge through both your biological lens of friction and my philosophical lens of meaning reveals just how delicate our balance really is.
It really does.
It forces us to examine our own daily lives and ask where we might be mistaking passive, aimless leisure for true restorative rest. There is so much more to explore in this material.
Which brings us right back to where we started. The next time you find yourself dreaming of that completely empty calendar with no itinerary, no obligations, and absolutely zero friction, you might want to pause and ask yourself, are you actually seeking rest, or are you just stepping into a vacuum?